Get out, you can't be in here.
Don't listen to anything she says. She's a holographic representation of the Red Queen.
You have to get out.
Modeled after the head programmer's daughter. She'll try to deceive us, confuse us.
I wouldn't advise this. Disabling me will result in loss of primary power.
Say anything to stop us from shutting her down.
I implore you.
Implore away.
Please. Please. You're all going to die down here.
It's the Popcorn Digest with Gareth and Andy. It's the Popcorn Digest.
Hello and welcome to Popcorn Digest, the podcast about the films you love and some you don't. I'm your host Gareth Green, and joining me as always is my full-time co-host and part-time living dead zombie, Andrew Raphael.
Insert cheesy line of dialogue here.
And today we're spending time in a secret government lab where a deadly man-made pathogen has escaped its containment, leading to the infection of millions of people worldwide. But that's enough about the coronavirus, as we're watching Paul W.S. Anderson's Resident Evil. But is there life in this zombie movie yet? Or is Resident Evil so much of a switch your brain off kind of movie that it'll leave us undead too? Hi, Dad. I've got a trailer.
Deep underground, in a top secret research lab, security has been breached. A deadly virus capable of contaminating the entire world has been released.
Oh my god.
We have to get out of this building. What was that? It's the brakes!
It's okay, we're here to help.
Now, an elite team has been sent in to stop it.
5 hours ago, Red Queen went homicidal.
Who's the Red Queen?
State-of-the-art artificial intelligence.
The corporation's keeping a few secrets down here.
But they have only 3 hours left before it begins infecting and mutating the whole human race.
Enemy of the fanboy and terminal wife guy, Paul W.S. Anderson, is back to show us how not to make a video game movie with Resident Evil. Milla Jovovich is the amnesia-suffering Alice, a mostly naked action hero that is struggling to remember just who her character actually is. In this film that will leave you struggling to remember what the fuck even happened. We've already covered video game movies on this podcast, and you are somebody that has said previously you're not really much of a video game kind of guy.
I was thinking this morning, I think I've spent more time flossing my teeth than I have playing video games. So I've never really been into video games. I tried, I really did. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I got an N64. I must have played it for all of like 2 to 3 times. I think I played GoldenEye once. For me, I just don't have a gaming sensibility, so I can be stuck on a level for hours and hours and hours and not get anywhere because I don't really know where to go. So it's just not my thing at all.
Yeah.
Anything to do with video games, I'm basically treating them as their own self-contained film.
I actually think that's good for the podcast though, because it provides that like extra viewpoint really, because I mean, I am someone who is something of a gamer in a very casual sense. I'm what you would call a casual gamer, I guess.
Yeah.
Resident Evil is actually one of my favorite video game series of all time. Do you have any like understanding of what Resident Evil is, or like the kind of following that this game series has, or anything like that?
Not really, only that it's obviously involving zombies in a kind of modern urban setting, and it's quite popular. And there's been a lot of different, obviously there's a lot of films, but there's been a lot of games as well. And that's about it, really.
Okay.
I've been going through watching a supercut of all the Resident Evil films, the original 6 films. And obviously through that, I've got a good understanding of the relationship between the film series and the video games, and obviously some of the characters and concepts in the video games. So I've kind of gone about it that way. With this film, it kind of doesn't matter, because from my understanding, it has such a thin relationship to the video game anyway that it doesn't really matter whether you've played it or not, or know much about the lore of it. I think some of the later films bring more stuff in, but this one is more I'd say, standalone and self-contained and doing its own thing than some of the later ones.
Well, that's it. I mean, some of the later films do bring characters back from the series into the film, but it's also still a very tenuous link between the two.
Yeah.
This series is very much its own thing, which Capcom, I think, really enjoyed at the time. Capcom are the makers of the Resident Evil games. They wanted it to be its own separate thing that went its own different way, so that it wasn't beholden to their continuity, and they didn't have to beholden to the film's continuity as well. But yes, it is a very, very loose link, especially with this first film. It actually began as an unrelated, inspired by Resident Evil script that Paul W.S. Anderson was working on called Undead. And it was about a secret government lab underneath a mansion where a virus escapes and there's genetic mutations down there, etc., etc. It sounds pretty much like beat for beat the film that we eventually got here.
Yeah.
Only he's called it Resident Evil and added a few loose links between the two. And he did say that the unmade script was very much inspired by him playing the game Resident Evil as well.
Yeah.
Just to talk as well about my background with the series, this was actually like a touchstone game for me, a cornerstone game, in that it came out in 1996. I was 10 years old, or coming up to 10 years old. I remember renting it from the video shop. And yeah, the first Resident Evil game, it was it was terrifying. And looking at it now and seeing these very blocky pixels move about.
Minecraft.
And it's crazy to think, but this was like the height of terror for us back then. And I loved it. And I've loved the series ever since, including its goofier moments. But I will also concede as well, there's a very large portion of the fan base that are very protective over Resident Evil and the games. But in terms of their story and in terms of their characters and in terms of their dialogue, they're not the best things in the world, you know?
No.
It's very, very cheesy.
Yeah.
The longer the series goes, the more it falls into soap opera kind of like dramatics, especially once Wesker is like the lead villain of the game series. And he's like this Agent Smith kind of really over-the-top camp villain.
Yeah.
But people are kind of like, why can't they do it right like this? And I watch it and go, yeah, but it's still just as cheesy.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing I always get with video games, and why video game adaptations have always failed or underwhelmed, because obviously you've got the whole gameplay aspect, which is gone, which I think I've talked about before when we've talked about a previous video game adaptation. You've lost that element of control, which is like a big part of the appeal of playing a video game. To be honest, bar a couple of exceptions, and I'd say really modern games like things like The Last of Us, which has obviously proven itself as being the only good video game adaptation as of recent, because it is based on something that's actually quite solid. But the vast majority of video games are fine when you're playing them, but when you extrapolate the story out, you are dealing with very B-movie concepts. Yeah. So it's natural that when you make adaptations of these, they are going to turn out as B-movies. And Resident Evil is no exception. It's
absolutely.
I say up to a point, this was a rather nice little B-movie. But yeah, I'll go into where it falls down, which is for me is quite crucial where it falls down. Yeah, part of me wishes that he'd just made this Undead script as it was, although to be honest, given the title of that, it may have just failed in exactly the same way, because I'm not going to reveal what the major issue with this film is for me yet, but well, you can probably guess already.
I think I can guess, yeah. Okay, so just to provide some context then for this film and when it was made and when it was released, it did actually go through quite an interesting period of development, let's say. Especially there's a very famous unmade version of this adaptation. That is the unmade George Romero Resident Evil script. So immediately after the release of the Resident Evil game, and it was a huge success, Constantin Films snaps up the rights to the series within 9 months, I believe, with the intention of having a film in production the following year. So the game series came out in 96. They wanted to have a film in production in 97. And originally the series was handed to Alan B. McElroy. He wrote the film Spawn. Had also written Halloween 4 Is that The Curse of Michael Myers?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one.
He wrote it in a week.
His version of the script, it hewed pretty close to the game in terms of like the main beats. There was a mansion, there's an underground lab, there are monsters, etc., etc. However, the characters were changed, the villains were changed, there was no mention of Umbrella. So in some ways it was very loose, and in other ways it was still beholden to that main underground plot. And it was after that that the film eventually came to George Romero. I don't know if you've seen this, Andy, but George Romero was first brought on board. Resident Evil 2 came out, and that took the series into a more urban setting. Mm-hmm. And Capcom hired George Romero and allowed him to develop a 1 minute long advertisement for $1 million to showcase the game. And it was like a live action role play thing. And it starred Brad Renfro and Adrian Francis. That is really the moment that the George Romero thing really began, because once he made that, they decided let's go to the king of the zombie movie, the guy that created the modern zombie as we know today. I mean, do you have experience with like George Romero's like films as well?
A little bit, not as much as you. They still seem like quite a different kind of thing to what this is. Yeah, this feels more like high-tech and futuristic.
Yeah.
A lot of Romero's stuff is kind of dingy, like it's either present day or very like grubby, and it's very different to what this is. But at the same time, you can kind of understand why they would want to get somebody who's so renowned for directing zombie movies to helm this. It's a nice piece of PR, if nothing else.
I read an interview with him from his later years. It was like in the 2010s. And he did mention that in his like heart of hearts, he knew that the game was kind of a rip-off of his movies, and that he wanted to jump on board this and really kind of show them how it's done. And it would have been the opportunity for him to do a film on a scale that he hasn't been allowed to make or at least up until that point, hadn't been allowed to make a zombie movie of that type. Mm-hmm. Even towards the end of his career, it was still like the great regret for him that he was unable to get this off the ground, because he really did like the script that he had created. So it is a shame that it never came to fruition. I've read the scripts. I've read 2 scripts that George Romero wrote, and they have issues, but they have their charm as well. But I also look at, like, he only made 2 films during the 90s, and the one that I've seen, the one where he made a short with Dario Argento, I think it's called like 2 Evil Eyes or something like that. It's still very, it's got like, I know it's a low budget film, but it's got a kind of almost TV movie-esque feel to it as well. So I do wonder if at this point in the 90s, would it have still felt like a real B-movie TV movie type thing?
It sounded as well, because of the appeal of the Resident Evil games, that the kind of film that he wanted to make wasn't what the production company wanted. Like, I think I think I read that if it had gone ahead, it would have probably got like an NC-17 rating, which is not what they wanted.
It's weird to think, and I guess this explains the bloodless nature of the final film that we got.
Yeah.
But the exec director of Constantine, Bernd Eichinger, there's talk that the reason that this particular iteration fell through is because he wanted to make a prestige version of the game with no focus on gore whatsoever, and more of a focus on the sci-fi element, which the game does have a sci-fi element. There are labs underneath this mansion and that kind of thing's going on, but I would say that the horror is foremost and the sci-fi element is secondary, whereas the eventual adaptation, it's almost like a switch on that. The sci-fi stuff is to the forefront, and all of the zombie stuff is almost like dressing.
Yeah.
It almost explains how the film kind of like ended up being the way that it is with that as well.
Yeah.
Also, there were things like there was a lot more monsters in the Romero version. This is what I would say, reading the script as well. People can read it online. I'm not going to go through what exact differences there were in that script because it's not worth it. But there were a lot of monsters in that version. It was quite chaotic because of that as well, because it felt like every 10 minutes just they were introduced to a new monster from the Resident Evil series, and you never really got a grip of what was going on. And it felt almost episodic in that way as well. Like it was like period of walking about boss battle, period of walking about boss battle kind of thing. Even the script had that issue. And yeah, I guess that really kind of takes us straight up to the Anderson version. So George Romero left because of irreconcilable differences between his viewpoint of what a film in the Resident Evil series should be and what Capcom and Constantine did think it should be. And then we move to Anderson, really. In between, there is this like flirtation with the director Jamie Blanks, who did
Urban Legend.
Yeah, he directed Urban Legend. He wanted to make a film that was just solely based on Resident Evil 2 and 3. I think that didn't go ahead due to budgetary concerns, and, well, he's the director of Urban Legend. And eventually they find themselves at Paul W.S. Anderson's door, the guy who's made probably the only successful video game adaptation at that point with Mortal Kombat. We'd had Tomb Raider, I think, as well by then, but even that was not regarded as a runaway success.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because we've talked about Paul W.S. Anderson before, initially in a very harsh light, and then I think in our Soldier episode we're a little bit more favourable. I'd seen Event Horizon by that point as well, which we haven't reviewed on this show. This feels a bit like a backward step for him.
Yeah.
And I feel like his trajectory that he was going through had been, he'd had that double hitter of Soldier, then directing Event Horizon on the downtime from Soldier, and then finishing Soldier, and basically having both of those films
flop.
Even though Event Horizon's now got quite a cult following. Yeah, it's strange that this is the film where he started to lose his mojo, but at the same time, I would say this is still a much better film than AVP in all aspects. Yeah. I still think that this film is, for the most part, quite well done, especially I think it's shot quite well.
Yeah, I agree.
There's still effort put into the settings and the lighting and the atmosphere for quite a lot of it.
I mean, it's weird that when we get Paul W.S. Anderson's triumphant return to the series directing chair, it's like, hey, I've just managed to get my hands on a James Cameron 3D camera. And
3D!
Everybody's just, and that's all it is. It looks just atrocious.
Literally just before we started, I was watching the supercut of that, and it looks pretty horrendous, considering the second film of this doesn't look that great, but the third one has kind of a fairly nice post-apocalyptic Mad Max feel to it, which is the Russell Mulcahy directed entry. But yeah, the fourth one looks like a so cheap in comparison.
It's weird. The films get kind of bigger in scope from that point, but look cheaper and cheaper.
They're probably working with the same money. That's the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
They're getting bigger, but they've got the same budget.
I think that's it. Throughout the series, the budget bounces somewhere around 35 million to 55 million.
Yeah.
And kind of stays there. And when it's a 3D movie, they said they got to add about 10.
Yeah, and inflation's going quite rapidly as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Considering this is when was the last film released? It's 15-year period nearly?
Yes,
something like
I
that.
think so, yeah.
So this is one of those series where every time you heard another one was coming out, I was like, another one? Really?
How?
And then when it came to the final chapter, you're like, oh, is it really the final chapter? And it was.
Quite a shock, really.
Yeah, it's quite a shock. That was the most shocking thing about this series, that the final chapter was actually the final chapter.
Even though it kind of still ended on a cliffhanger.
They'll pick it up again because the reboot failed. I can imagine they're going to be like, Resident Evil, The Return.
Yeah, Alice's Return. I can see it happening.
Yeah.
If it isn't already in motion, it'll be happening soon.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll go on record now to say Resident Evil is not the worst film I've seen, and it's not even a film that I would call particularly bad. It's just that it fails. I think we're going to have the same conversation, the same viewpoints here, but it fails at something that is fundamental to the zombie film, and that is that it's not scary, and it abandons the idea of being a horror film quite early on.
I'm going to lay my cards on the table now and basically say I really was quite enjoying this film up until about 40 minutes in.
Is that when the zombies appeared?
When the zombies arrive and it all falls apart.
Yeah.
When it's a film about this woman who doesn't know who she is, following this task force to try and shut down this facility with this virus, and there's a homicidal computer. That was all pretty fun. It was a fun little B movie. And then as soon as you throw in the zombies, it kind of just went... The other huge issue is the fact that the best scene in the film is in the first half hour, which is a problem.
It says everything that the laser corridor has a higher body count than any of the zombies do in the film.
Yeah.
And I will say that there is particularly, the best actress in this film for me is probably just that one zombie that gets her neck snapped. it peaks so early that the first zombie we see is the best zombie, and then everything from then onwards is just dull as dishwater. And it seems to progressively turn more and more into like the music as it goes as well. It turns more and more into the Matrix / Run Lola Run.
That aside, like the music was, even from the start, is kind of quite egregious.
Yes. It announces its presence pretty early on.
Yeah, it sounded like someone shredding a washboard or something like that. It's really weird as well because we've often, I think we've talked about Marco Beltrami before. You see him in person and he talks about stuff. It sounds really interesting, and the stuff he does is wacky as hell. Yeah, like I've seen him like play a piano, but the strings are like power lines and it's going across a valley and they're recording that, and he does really cool stuff, and then when it actually comes to the final product, it's really boring. And just it's really bizarre because he just sounds like a proper like maverick, but
all the elements are there.
It's a bit like Paul W.S. Anderson, because I think you've mentioned before, it's like I don't get it. He likes all the same things I like. His attitude's really good, but the end product never quite matches that.
Yeah, it never matches up. There's a moment that sums up this film for me. For this type of movie, it's a B movie. It's silly. I am fine with a goofy script. I am fine with a cheesy script.
Yeah.
However, this whole thing begins because there is a containment breach of like a little virus container in a quarantine room whose air conditioning it's hooked up to just the general underground laboratory air conditioning unit.
Yeah.
That's a massive oversight on behalf of the people that designed this underground lab.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it would have been better if they'd played a bit more on the homicidal computer program aspect of it and actually have it as a result of that. Like she'd siphoned it on purpose.
Yeah.
That would have been made it a bit more credible, but yeah, it's just, it's so dumb.
I think it's at that moment that it announces itself as the exact type of movie that it's going to be, and it's like, oh, right, switch everything off.
But yeah, I think that's the thing where it's like, it's really dumb and goofy, but it kind of worked to a certain point when it was that type of film.
Yes.
And then as soon as you throw the zombies in it, it tries to become a different kind of film, and it's so half-hearted, and it loses a lot of that first aspect. Colin Salmon is killed far too early in this film.
I do like the intention behind it.
Yeah.
Because Colin Salmon is such a strong presence anyway as an actor. And he's really like commando exposition up until that point.
I wrote, Colin Salmon, if you want quality exposition, he's your guy.
He is. If you want to hear like the sultry voice of Colin Salmon deliver lines such as like, there was a containment breach at 11:30 a.m. You know, like at level 3 we need to go into the laser.
Yeah, because I'm sure he's done like leading roles where he's not doing this, but I'm pretty sure every single thing I've ever seen him in, he's played this kind of role, an exposition role. Even when he was in Doctor Who, he played an exposition role in the episode that he was in. So it's just funny that literally he's been typecast as guy who gets information across.
But I do like that he's the only guy that kind of like knows what's going on in some capacity, and they kill him off pretty early. The rest of the group is fish out of water in that sense.
Yeah.
However, that would work better if Alice was a character in any way, shape or form at that point, because he's just a blank slate. She's there to just ask questions up until then. Yeah. And then suddenly we're thrust, oh, so this is the character? This is who we're following? Mm-hmm. And then she's kind of like forced to come back to the forefront. But yeah, I was enjoying this film up until just after the first introduction of the zombies, and it kind of loses its way as well. People seem to be just wandering off alone into the underground lab that's apparently full of zombies and then not full of zombies and then full of zombies again. And I think it's because as well, he gets the kind of basics of zombies wrong. And I don't mean in terms of shoot them in the head, the undead kind of thing, but just in terms of like minimizing their presence to such a point that they become dressing is an issue for me. When they kill people, there's no blood, there's no gore. There's opportunity for them to do like real tear apart moments.
Well, there's a few, isn't there?
Yeah, there's opportunity for them to create some really interesting and creatively gory zombies. You know, get the likes of Greg Nicotero and that kind of the people behind Walking Dead on board. Instead, it's all it feels almost PG-13.
Yeah.
And in fact, I would say that it's rated as an R, mainly because for some reason Milla Jovovich insists on flashing her bits with each film.
Yeah. I don't even think there's that many swear words in this film either. I mean, to be honest, you could recertify this as a PG-13, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think the only thing that could possibly send it over that would be the laser room sequence. Yeah. Even though it's bloodless, I think it's probably just slightly too edgy for a PG-13 film. That's literally it. If you took that out, which I wouldn't do because it's the best thing in the film, but it would be a PG. I mean, it would be a really limp film without that. So I'm glad it's there. I just wish it was a bit later and they used it more of that, because I know they use it again in later films.
Oh yeah, it's nowhere near as good.
It's one of those clips that even if you haven't seen the films like I have, I mean, I remember seeing that clip many years ago just because it does the rounds. It's that scene. The rest of the film's kind of shit, but that scene.
It was so popular they immediately put it into the fourth game.
Yeah,
as like a homage to what Paul W.S. Anderson did with this. They decided let's do that. And in fact, I actually think that this film kind of inspired the game makers to go off into a more action-heavy direction. Mm-hmm. So yeah, how's that gone for it as well? And we can't talk about really the laser corridor scene without mentioning, even just in an offhand manner, that it's inspired, I say in quotations, it's inspired by Cube, which also has a great cubing of an individual in that film as well.
It's also quite similar to that scene film, Ghost Ship.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Which I saw the opening clip of recently. That's way more gory than this version, because obviously this is lasers, so it's kind of like cauterizing, so that's why there's no blood sort of thing. So that scene in Ghost Ship is equally as ludicrous because that kind of thing just wouldn't happen, but it's just awesome in its kind of bloodiness. Yeah. That film's even more at a disposition because that's literally the first thing you see in the film.
And it never reaches that height again.
Yeah, whereas at least this is in like the first, like I think it's about the half-hour mark.
Yeah.
And there are some quite cool things in the opening, I think. I do like the elevator fake out. That's pretty cool.
What I like about that particular thing is, in terms of the Red Queen, the AI system that looks over and protects this underground lab, it kind of sets it up as being not only homicidal, but also even a little bit playful.
Yeah.
With that scene, she's playing with her food. Mm-hmm. The opening is, in my opinion, really strong. I love the elevator sequence as well, where we see the first elevator plummet to the ground and we hear it from inside the other one.
Yeah.
And it's like, there feels like there's a real sense of build-up, payoff, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It feels like a film that's comfortable with silences as well, because what immediately follows that scene is a sequence of Alice walking around an empty mansion, and it's all just kind of mood setting.
Yeah.
This all feels like the film that I kind of want to see.
Yeah.
That it really abandons the idea of being in the latter half.
It's weird that the film feels way more confident at that point, and then as soon as the zombies come through, it's kind of like, oh, I don't know what to do with that. And then also, even on a structural level, because it's quite taut up until that point.
Yes. Yeah.
On a story structure level, it just kind of goes like that as soon as the zombies come as well. So it starts to fall apart even on a editorial level as well. It's like they put loads of effort into those first 40 minutes and then just gave up.
Yeah, I mean, there are weird things that happen from like the halfway point as well. As I say, characters seem to split up and find themselves in environments where there are zombies, there aren't zombies. There's a moment as well with the Eric Morbius, whatever his name is.
I think,
Morbius. Eric Morbius. Yeah, there's a moment where Eric Morbius is looking for his sister. He's rifling through some things on the floor, and there's a zombie that suddenly appears at a window in front of him. And you get this like musical sting that kind of like builds up, like it's building to something that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And then we cut out of the scene. And when we cut back again, Eric's just doing something different.
Yeah, that was weird.
Yeah, it's all very strange that way. It feels like, as you say, I feel like they lose confidence in what the film is, and it becomes a little bit directionless at that point.
I think I actually wrote something down somewhere about that, and I was like, oh no. It's like that kind of...
It's like the biggest case of blue balls ever.
There's one thing, I think when the guy gets pulled into an elevator, I was like, oh, Day of the Dead-esque, and then I was expecting a Day of the Dead style pulling apart of somebody, That didn't happen.
No, yeah.
There's another thing where there's a real odd cut where Alice and Thingy rejoin the rest of the group, but there's like a sequence missing.
Yes, so they cover it up with their holographic representation of them running down a corridor.
Yeah, because where they were in the previous scene doesn't match up to them running towards this. It feels like there's a scene missing.
It's established as well in this scene prior with Rain and all the other commandos that this particular door is blocked by hundreds of zombies.
Yeah.
And then suddenly in the next shot, they're running down in holographic representation. They're running down an empty corridor with the zombies directly behind them. How?
Also, it does the classic thing of setting up the ticking clock and then forgetting about it.
Yeah, I think I forgot about it. Yeah.
And the thing is, you're in an underground facility with the odds stacked up against you. That it writes itself in terms of how you actually go about ramping up the tension against the time. I mean, it probably would have helped if they'd actually had less than an hour to get out. They really should have ramped that up because it sets it up, then completely forgets about it until literally like 30 seconds before the doors are going to come down.
Yeah, exactly.
When it tries to ramp it up again, it's like, no, you forgot about it. You're not earning that moment.
And I love the budget-saving way that they show that the facility is locking down. By
They don't even show the doors. It's just a shadow.
It's just a shadow.
Just somebody with a piece of cardboard going over a light.
I mean, that's what I like about Paul W.S. Anderson, though, and I've liked about through his career up until a certain point, is that he does seem to be someone who works well with a limited budget. His films, up until a point, still look quite competent. I mean, that's like the baseline, but they look quite competent, or they have a striking look about them. And it's normally in silly other ways that he trips himself up in very obvious ways, fundamental flaws. But he seems to still have a kind of creative mind when it comes to working with a budget a little bit.
Even from where they decided to shoot the film really played into that because this was entirely shot in Berlin.
Yes.
Both in a soundstage, but then also on location. A lot of the bunker scenes are actually U-Bahn stations and things like that. And obviously in Berlin, there's a lot of neo-brutalist architecture.
Yes.
Like, it's one of my favorite places to go. Like, it's just ridiculous amount of history, and it's just a really interesting and cool place regardless. Yeah, there's so much like cool architecture, and even that last shot of the film where it pulls out, so obviously Berlin.
Yeah.
Like it's doubling for Raccoon City.
I like that.
But just like the fact that it kind of shows him like, I want to do this is a good place to go. We can use a lot of stuff without actually having to build anything. Yeah, so you can definitely see that.
This is essentially, though, it's like a Euro horror film.
Yeah.
It doesn't really have many ties to American financiers. It's Constantin is a German company, I think.
Yeah.
And it's based on a property that comes from a Japanese company. And Sony as well are the distributors of it. So in many ways, it's like it doesn't have many ties to America despite it being based there. And I quite like the Euro horror feel that this film has. It does remind me of other Euro horror films of that period as well. Even though there is very little that is like outside in the real world, even the sets and locations that they find, as you mentioned, it's like a lot of neo-brutalist kind of look. Like, I really like the train station set, and it's clear that they really mine that for everything that it's worth. Because oftentimes it's just that set redressed in many different ways.
Yeah.
And I quite like that look to it. But every time I see it, I'm like, it feels like Euro horror. And also everybody but, Michelle Rodriguez is putting on this kind of like American accent, despite the fact that they're all Euro trash like us.
Yeah. Michelle Rodriguez in this film is a bit weird. She doesn't quite mix with the rest of the cast either. It's kind of weird that she's just bizarre that she's in this film, and she has all the worst lines as well. She
does. She has one strong scene, and it's the only scene as well where we get to see a little bit of bloodshed, and that's the scene where she's holding her hand out over the zombies and it's bleeding, and she's just letting it drip on them, and they're all kind of scrambling for it. That's the only moment in the film as well that I get a sense of horror from the zombies as well.
Yeah.
There is an issue with Michelle Rodriguez in that when they were making this film, originally her character was supposed to be much smaller, but then Michelle Rodriguez kind of like campaigned to be in any adaptation of Resident Evil that was being made because she loved the games. And she managed to get into this film but there wasn't really a role for her. So they kind of embellished one of the smaller characters. And in the writing of the film as well, because Michelle Rodriguez was a star that was rising to quite a height at that time, just before production, they kind of went too far and almost made Rain the protagonist.
Yeah.
And then Milla Jovovich was like, oh, but you've kind of minimized my role completely. I'm suddenly just a damsel in distress throughout this thing. So during the making of the film, they had this issue where they were constantly grappling with just how much of a presence Michelle Rodriguez should have and how much of a presence Milla Jovovich should have.
Yeah.
It's weird that this happened. I think that they kind of settle into Alice. I know that in the latter half, she just becomes kind of an action hero, but again, that is something that people responded to. They kept coming back to the series to watch Milla Jovovich break people with her thunder thighs. You know, just...
And her mind powers. He shook me like a dog with her mind powers.
And she says, Milla Jovovich does say that, in her opinion, her character gets better as the film goes. I'm not too sure about that. She definitely gets more to do in the latter half.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I'm talking really with the benefit of knowing where the series goes after this point, really.
Yeah.
And how silly it gets with that character. But yeah, that is something that they grappled with throughout the entire film, just how much presence she should have. And in the end, I think, like, the Rain character, the Michelle Rodriguez character, who really, Michelle Rodriguez, she's made a career for herself out of scowling up until that point. And fair play to her, man, she nailed it. But she does feel out of place, and it almost feels like her character should have probably been dropped at some other point in the film.
Yeah, it's a bit weird as well, because I feel like she's bitten so many times in this film and doesn't succumb. Like, she's bitten really early on as well, and it takes forever for her to succumb to the virus, to the point where, yeah, that antivirus ain't gonna work.
You know what, as well, like, talking about the Umbrella Corporation for a moment.
Yeah.
You know, if you are undercover for the Umbrella Corporation and you're in a sham marriage, an undercover sham marriage.
Yeah.
Do you think it's necessary to have the words property of Umbrella Corporation engraved into your wedding rings?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be like the first giveaway that perhaps there's more than meets the eye about this relationship?
Yeah.
It's like having your wedding ring engraved with property of Asda Walmart.
I don't think they did enough to establish how overarching this corporation was or wasn't.
I mean, I love that as the series goes on as well. Like, essentially outside, it's the apocalypse. You don't see, like, a single city that's still together. You don't see, many people at all. It feels like it's a world populated by about 20 individuals. And still the Umbrella Corporation is having, like, board meetings underground.
It's the by and large of this series.
It is.
But they never really established that in the first one. So you're kind of having to fill in the blanks yourself.
Yeah.
There's no point even trying to dissect that because, it is kind of ill-defined anyway.
Yeah.
Because it is just insert corporation business here.
Yeah.
Very simple
Very simple anti-corporation movie as well in that way, like an anti-monopolizing corporation movie.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a film that if you spent more than a week writing, I'd be having some words and questioning.
One of my favourite lines is when they're stood in front of a couple of laboratories that are completely flooded. They are full to the roof, flooded, and there are, like, bodies floating within there.
Yeah.
Then Colin Salmon says, go check out the area and see how bad the flooding is. I'm like, well, from where we're standing, it looks pretty bad, Colin. But yeah, it's just like moments like that, really clunky lines of dialogue. And at times as well, with other characters, it's delivered by actors that are really, like, soap TV actors as well.
Yeah.
And some of them who have English as not their first language, doing an American accent.
Yeah, I think it also doesn't help that the villain of this is quite weak. The whole James Purefoy character.
Yeah.
He doesn't do enough to establish himself throughout the rest of the movie, to the point when you have the switch, you kind of just go, great. It comes far too late as well. The switch comes far too late for him to actually be effective, because I think the time between him switching and him actually being killed off is about 5 minutes.
Yes, yeah, exactly, yeah. In fact, I would say that the most interesting thing about his character is that in the commentary, it's mentioned that the actor, James Purefoy, used his own jeans instead of a costume prop. So this is a film where really that really kind of like sums up for me that this was a film where he walked in and was like, nah, I'm wearing my own jeans.
Yeah.
This is pure comfort for me.
James Purefoy is definitely one of those almost actors.
Yes,
He's like Dougray Scott, kind of lost out on so many different things or fell out with certain people that he just, his claim to fame now is those Fisherman's Friends movies.
That he's got a film based on a menthol sweet.
Yeah.
But also before that point, his claim to fame was getting fired from V for Vendetta.
Yeah.
Which says everything, because he signed on to the film and didn't realise that his face wouldn't be seen in the entire thing.
Yeah.
It sounds weird, really, that would happen.
Yeah.
And he nearly had his big franchise as well with Solomon Kane.
I think it was even on the shortlist for Bond, for GoldenEye, and again for Casino Royale. Yeah, I don't think they would have ever really seriously considered him because he's just build-wise, he's quite weedy. He's not...
He'd knock you out, mate.
But...
I'm only joking.
But he's one of those actors that's like, he doesn't quite have it. Bless him.
He's missing the X factor.
Yeah.
I don't mind James Purefoy, but I also don't miss him in anything. It's not like there are some actors where I feel like they've had an almost career where I'm like, oh God, they're just missing that one good role. And then you read about all the films that they missed out on and you go, oh yeah, that could have been it for them. And that could have been it for them. And that could have been it for them.
Yeah.
With him, I'm kind of like, oh yeah, probably the right person won.
Yeah.
I guess one thing to ask as well is, do you think that Milla Jovovich has a thing against dogs?
Maybe.
Because she fucking loves shooting dogs in this film.
Yeah.
That for me is the moment. That's for me the moment that the film stops dead and kind of falls apart. And that character falls apart as well, is the moment that she does like a 3-point kick off the wall to kick a zombie dog in their head. That's the moment where it drops any pretense of being horror at all.
Yeah.
Because there is a nice moment earlier on. Like the only moment, I mentioned a moment where the zombies work with Rain's character, and it's just a very basic shot. And another fundamental shot that works for setting up the zombies as having a presence is the one in which Eric Mabius's character is stood in a corridor. It's just another quiet moment, another confidently quiet moment where he's looking up towards a ventilation shaft. And it zooms in on it, and you can just about hear in the distance, somewhere down the corridor, somewhere through the ventilation system, you can hear groans of zombies. And this is before we've seen really anything. So it's another like 20 minutes before the zombies actually appear. The setups like that, I'm like, oh, that's, it gets under your skin a little bit. It's like a little moment of tension, and it's just a fundamental, very simple trick. And then half an hour later, you have Alice doing flying kicks in zombie dogs' heads, and it's all very like, hey, we've just seen The Matrix.
Didn't they have problems with those zombie dogs anyway because they kept licking their makeup off?
Yes. They kept shagging Alice's leg. Yes, they kept licking the makeup off.
Yeah.
It's just corn syrup.
You've covered me in food.
This is the moment as well where the soundtrack for me breaks. It becomes really over the top. I don't know what it is. It's like some kind of like reverse drum beat that plays during the whole thing, and it just feels out of continuity with everything else in the film. And then from that point onwards, it starts to sound more and more like a Prodigy opening act.
Yeah, I mean, it's classic music that worked against the film as well. Like, there's parts of the music where you can tell they've had problems integrating it into the sound mix because there's bits where you can't hear the dialogue very well because the music's going like that. It's like, it's really like not good film music at all.
No.
It's so of the time as well. It dates the film really badly.
I don't mind the Marco Beltrami ambient stuff very early on. When she's walking about the empty mansion and you have this ethereal feel to it as well.
Yeah.
It's like when it becomes hard rock, hard EDM stuff almost.
Yeah.
And all the Marilyn Manson stuff as well is straight from the, like a Doom soundtrack.
Yeah.
It feels really out of place here when a traditional horror score would have probably benefited the film far, far more.
Yeah.
And as I say, Marilyn Manson involved in this film. Garbage human being as far as we know. Garbage score.
He will not be named. It's like Lord Voldemort.
Yeah.
The only other major thing about this film we haven't really talked about is the is it the liquor? Is that what he's referred to as?
Yes, that's what I was just getting to. Yeah, the liquor. So just to give some background on this character, it appeared in the second game.
Yeah.
It's not a boss battle or anything of the sort. It's just a kind of like common enemy. but it had a very kind of striking look and was a bit of a fan favourite.
Yeah.
How did you like The Liquor?
It was okay. In fact, it kind of made me think, oh, when they were looking at AVP, they're like, oh, this guy's done stuff that's a bit like Alien. Yeah. It's one of those things where it looks fine in some shots, and then in other shots, it doesn't look good at all.
Yeah.
It's like 50-50.
I think the shot where it crawls from the ceiling from one of the kind of light shafts is pretty good.
Yeah.
And then the shot where it kind of turns to the camera immediately following.
Yeah.
And kind of mugs for the security camera is awful.
To be perfectly honest, I would have rather that they lost the zombies and just had this AI and this creature in this bunker.
Yeah, like a proper, like an alien thing, yeah.
That's all you needed. You didn't need... The zombies were so superfluous, and they were like... It just felt like an obligation to put them in.
Yes, they do.
It felt like Paul W.S. Anderson was way more interested in those other aspects than the zombies.
It does make me laugh that apparently the shot of the liquor eating Spence, James Purefoy's character...
Yeah.
I read a review of a test screening, and it actually summarised that bit and mentioned that you just see the liquor jump at him, and then the next time we see him, he's dead. You don't ever see the point in which it's eating him. That's something that they must have shot as a reshoot. But it does make me laugh that the way in which they've framed that is to make it look very, very sexual. It's going to town on his nether regions, it seems.
I was just looking at my notes, and I did say James Purefoy killed by liquor, badly cut together. That's what I put.
What happened to your character in the film? Oh, well, I got terribly sucked off by a character called The Liquor.
I got badly edited to death.
The Liquor kind of summarises for me the biggest issue, and it goes to the zombies. It goes to this character as well. I like this character, the Liquor. I agree with you that perhaps if the zombies, they weren't doing anything with them on any level other than dressing, that they should have got rid of them. Had these genetic mutations instead, or even just this one thing, could have saved them some money and allowed them to do other things with the film as well.
Yeah.
But my issue is that we have all of these elements. We have the undead. We have genetic mutations. We have this liquor that the Red Queen says is the result of injecting the virus directly into a subject, into living tissue. There's an element of body horror that this film has in the most peripheral sense.
Yeah.
That it actually refuses to explore. And can you imagine a Ripley 8 scene from Resurrection where they go through a lab? Who are the people that they're injecting the virus into? Are they prisoners? Are they, military staff or that kind of thing? There needed to be a scene where you get to find out the more nefarious things that this company has been doing. Let's go through the lab where there are the test subjects, and let's see some of their failed test subjects and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, they almost do it as well, because in the last scene in the film where they get out and Eric Mabius's character's been bitten by the liquor, and then he starts mutating to turn into Nemesis. But no, we're going to roll him off now because we can use that for the sequel.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, he's mutating!
Finally!
Don't roll him off now.
He's just become interesting.
They should have had another character that was bitten by the liquor that mutated much earlier.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't capitalize on the things that are working. And again, it feels obliged to feature these things that don't work.
Yeah.
Like that whole sequence where they're crawling on the gantry with all the zombies going with their hands up like that.
Yeah.
It's so limp. Even the fake out with the suicide, with the guy with the gun in his mouth, and then it cuts back and he's just shot a zombie, and it's just a bit the...
Yeah.
And then, that character comes back only to be, killed almost instantaneously anyway, so what's the point?
Yeah.
Yeah, anything involving the zombies was really limp. Even the thing with the sister, they made nothing of that.
I know that they kind of go back to this and retcon it a lot as well. They reframe this whole virus thing in a whole different ways in the later ones, but that is a particular element that just... There's just no substance to it. And there's no substance to the movie in general anyway. It is a true turn your brain off kind of film.
Part of me thinks there must have been more with that as well, considering who they cast as that sister character.
Yeah.
Was it Heike? I can never pronounce the surname. From Love Actually, who's Daniel Craig's girlfriend at the time.
Yes, yeah.
There's elements that could have been played on much, much harder, but it's like they've had to do all this zombie stuff. Even from when you read about the production and them filming the zombies, it's like he didn't really have much interest in doing anything new with the zombies. either.
Yeah.
It's like, even the fact that you have like Jeremy Bolt, who's one of the producers, who's like him and Paul W.S. Anderson, they come as a pair. He's in the background somewhere as an extra. That's to the level of how much they didn't really give a shit about the zombies, or they didn't know what to do with them or care.
I'm right with you on that one. It's weird to say, though, I don't know if his film would have gotten made as well at this time.
No, it wouldn't have done.
The strange thing about this film is that, coupled with 28 Days Later, is that it has the reputation of having injected some life into the zombie genre again in the noughties, and we're still kind of living through that now with The Walking Dead. And I know that's just finished, but there are 1,000 spin-offs coming out, and we still get zombie movies every now and again as well. We've just had The Last of Us, which is essentially, it's a infection movie, but they're all zombie movies. And this was the film that kind of kickstarted it again. And 28 Days Later, strangely enough, 28 Days Later by Danny Boyle and Alex Garland, I read an interview with them where they mentioned that they had a conversation with Paul W.S. Anderson as well, and somebody asked, did you tell them everything that he got wrong with Resident Evil? And they said, well, we kind of made 28 Days Later as a response to having watched Resident Evil.
I mean, Resident Evil might have increased its popularity, but it didn't do anything new with the zombies.
No.
And I think anything that the more modern shows are doing now, I think you can just trace back to 28 Days Later, because that completely just style-wise as well, like, you made it more realistic and grounded, which this film doesn't do.
Certainly in a kind of like an inspiration way, in terms of like filmmakers taking inspiration from something. 28 Days Later is a critical, and it's quality-wise, I would say almost objectively, is the better film.
Yeah.
But also, you wouldn't get 28 Days Later being made without Resident Evil having come out.
Yeah.
It's that kind of double-edged sword. So even in that level, I'm kind of appreciative that it exists, including all its flaws. And it is half a pretty decent B-movie and half a very flawed B-movie.
And again, it still has a little bit of that Paul W.S. Anderson spark before it gets completely extinguished with AVP, which is such a nothing film. That's an atrocious film.
I mean, the Paul W.S. Anderson that makes films now, I have to mention this because it's something that I found out about him between the Soldier episode and now.
Yeah.
There is an incident that happened on the set of Resident Evil, the final chapter, with Olivia Jackson, who was a stunt double for Charlize Theron on Mad Max Fury Road.
Yeah.
There was an incident as a result of alleged and reported failures by the production team and by the director, some fundamental failures that resulted in her having catastrophic injuries and eventually having a limb amputated as well. It was truly like catastrophic injury.
Oh, wow.
Paul W.S. Anderson and Jeremy Bolt, again, reportedly, allegedly, I have to say, they handled that situation very, very poorly, and very publicly very poorly, to the point in which she was kind of abandoned by the production team and forced to have to front all the cost of the situation by herself. So I think in that way, I have to bring it up that although I have an appreciation for some elements of Paul W.S. Anderson, I still firmly believe that given the controversy surrounding his later career, he perhaps shouldn't be working in the industry anymore.
Yeah. Increasingly, like, I'm just looking at his like films he's made after that. It's like films made from a bygone era, that 2000s era that should be left in the 2000s.
Yeah. We all enjoyed Monster Hunter.
Yeah. It just sounds like a director that's just really lost his perspective. It's one of those ones where you can't comment because we're not there.
Yes.
And you're not sure whether he's even done stuff like this earlier on as well. It's difficult to say, like, whether he's had this kind of reckless non-committal. But at the same time, the results speak to himself. The results for that just speak for themselves, and it's kind of, he probably shouldn't be making films now.
And to be honest, at the end of the day as well, when it comes to what we've talked about with Resident Evil, there should be no situation where somebody is... I mean, stunt people... This is why I believe that stunt people should have, like, far more recognition in the industry, and in terms of an Oscar sense and stuff like this. But stunt people do risk their lives for the sake of art, for the sake of films. But at the end of the day, for something like Resident Evil, nobody should be putting their life into reckless danger for the sake of a Paul W.S. Anderson film.
Yeah.
That just shouldn't be happening. But let's have a look at the stats and facts. Let's leave Resident Evil in the dust and look towards what the critics and the box office says about this film. So I'll begin with the critics, the critical consensus. It has a 35% tomato reading on Rotten Tomatoes. A strong 35%. It says, like other video game adaptations, Resident Evil is loud, violent, formulaic, and cheesy. I mean, I agree with that. It sounds almost a positive, almost, of that right up.
Yeah.
It has a score of 4.6 out of 10 from the critics as well, an average score. But in terms of the audience score, it has a 67% rating and a 3.6 out of 10 average rating from that audience. And yeah, I mean, it is a film that has certainly grown an audience since its release as well. And people do regard this one as one of the stronger Resident Evil films. I certainly do as well. Mm-hmm. Like I say, it's not a particularly terrible film. It's fundamentally flawed, even as a B movie, but it's still competently made. There are worse ways to be able to spend your time. And I've watched it, shamefully, I've watched this film more times than I can care to admit as well. It's just one of those films that I'm drawn back to. So there must be something in it for that. However, one person that did not respond to this film in any way, shape, or form is Roger Ebert. And he reached up to me from hell to provide me with this review. No, this is from his website, and it says, Resident Evil is a zombie movie set in the 21st century and therefore reflects several advances over 20th century films. For example, in the 20th century slasher movies, knife blades make a sharpening noise when being whisked through the air. In the 21st century, large metal objects make crashing noises by just being looked at. And he gave the film 1 out of 4 stars.
Yeah.
One thing that I did like about this is, like, anytime somebody does turn their gun, move their gun into shot, it kind of just rattles, you know? It makes me think that it's put together by Lego. The film has an IMDb rating of 6.6 out of 10, which, again, for this type of film is a strong rating. In regards to the box office, the budget for the film was $33 million, or I think it was between $33 and $35 million from what I could gather. Domestically, the film made $40 million, and worldwide it made $103 million. So it was a modest success. Mm-hmm. You can see why they would put a similar budget into a sequel as well. And for a while, this was kind of the turnover for these films. They made somewhere between 100 to 120 million, up until they introduced 3D, and then it became like a $300 million juggernaut. Here we go. Here's the top 10 that this film opened against in 2002. So Resident Evil opened at number 2. At number 1, we had Ice Age. And at number 2, Resident Evil opened with $17 million. Number 3 was Showtime. Number 4 was The Time Machine, which strangely was in its second weekend. And I forgot that it opened at number 1 in the first weekend of release. Number 5 was We Were Soldiers. Number 6 was All About the Benjamins. Number 7 was 40 Days and 40 Nights, the rape apologist movie. Number 8 was John Q. That's the film in which Josh Hartnett brings a woman to climax by
blowing flowers.
Blowing flowers? Yeah, what the fuck? Yeah. And it's the best film that ends with a date rape. Anyway, and it's just so bad. Number 8 is John Q. Number 9 was A Beautiful Mind. And number 10 was one of your favourites, Andy, Peter Pan 2, Return to Neverland.
Oh.
And just as well to give some context as to when this film was released, and number 11 was The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. Once more, we seem to be going up against that greatest of franchises.
Was this released in March, I think?
Yes, March the 15th to 17th that weekend.
So this gives you a pretty good picture of how film releases were done back then. Like you did have these summer periods and the slowly emerging Christmas period as well.
Yes.
But even so, in between that, you had these backwater periods for all these other kind of films.
Yeah.
Whereas now they have to just slot in whenever.
Like, as you say, the blockbuster period now is all year round. We've obviously seen that the Fuck You, It's January movie as well has fallen by the wayside. Any date is a free date to release a blockbuster now.
Yeah.
And these kind of films just really don't get made that much anymore. And if they do, it's for streaming purposes.
Yeah, I think the streaming movie, the Netflix movie, not the prestige Netflix films, but the regular Netflix films are that kind of film now.
Yeah.
Murder Mystery 2's coming out in the next like week or so.
Yeah.
If that was made 15 years ago, that would be released in this kind of period.
Yeah, it would, yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure what happened with... I know that the reboot of this series didn't do so well.
So
the Netflix series as well.
The Netflix series was just bad. The reboot was shaky, but you could tell that it had been absolutely gutted by the coronavirus, because it was a film that unfortunately went into production just as the coronavirus kind of started happening, the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so it went from being an adaptation of the second game, which is in an urban environment with a kind of like an actual city being overrun by zombies. They had to really par that back, and suddenly it was like you only have one or two zombies on screen. There's only characters seem to be constantly isolated from each other, even when they're sharing the same screen and that kind of thing. And the budget got slashed as well as a result, because nobody knew what was going to happen to the theatrical experience at that point. There was this talk of it never coming back again, even.
Yeah.
So the film will stand as like an example, a curious example of what happened during the pandemic, during those early days to certain films. But as it is by itself, it's a pure missed opportunity, really. And it tried to do too much with too little, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so that's where we're at with the series. I will say, is Resident Evil something that you would recommend?
No, not really. I think it kind of boils down back to that laser room sequence, because that is something I saw many, many years before. And it's literally just like, I'd just recommend, watch this cool laser room sequence. That's all you need to see.
Have you seen Cube? No. Good. All right. so there's this laser sequence.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say yes, but just about, like I'm scraping by. It's a film that I, guilty pleasure maybe, I've gone back to more often than I would care to admit. It's certainly a leave your brain at the door kind of movie, maybe one to fall asleep to if you have it on low. I also have to say as well, like, for all of, for example, the likes of Captain fucking Marvel talking about how this is the first film for feminists with a female lead doing blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
Resident Evil was doing that shit like decades prior.
Oh yeah. I mean,
I quite like that it's a series with a like an action heroine Ripley-esque lead, but it kind of like, even from that first film, puts the women at the forefront.
Yeah.
But I would say, if you know what you're getting when you watch a Resident Evil film now, you don't need me to recommend it to you or not. You just know what you're getting now.
I mean, to be honest, as talking about it as like a Euro film, if you actually look back at the history of like action films, especially in the sort of the 90s and 2000s, many of the European ones are female-led. You know, you only have to look at things like Nikita, and even the Fifth Element is kind of the main person that gets to do shit is her in that. And, you know, it just runs all the way through. You Run Lola Runs, all that.
Lola Run is the film that this kind of, for some reason, I kept going back to in my notes. But yeah, I think it's just because of Milla Jovovich's look. And as I say, the sound of the film, I found out afterwards that this film was temp tracked, especially in the latter half, with a lot of Run Lola Run music. And that kind of really shows. And this is also a film that Junkie XL worked on in a very small capacity, so has the beginnings of his career here.
And then obviously you got later films like Hannah and Lucy, and the European films, they're always a little bit more progressive when it comes to that kind of stuff than the US stuff. So it's no coincidence that this is kind of a Euro feeling film anyway, that it has that element to it.
It's the only film in this series as well that has that identity, and I like that about it. It feels, I guess it's a nostalgia thing as well, but I like a lot of Euro action films, and this still has that feel to it as well.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's all we have time for on this episode of Popcorn Digest. If you join us next time, what are we going to be covering, Andy?
Okay, so we're reviewing one movie. Oh no, wait, it's two films. Is it one film? Is it two films? My brain's exploded. We are doing The Exorcist prequels.
Oh my word. And just to confirm, these aren't sequels. This is two of the same film.
But not, but yes, but not.
Completely different, but yes, the same film. But until then, I've been Gareth.
And I've just been chewing my arm in the last half an hour, so, you know.
Itchy tasty. Thanks for listening.